One morning, Christian woke with the feeling that something had to change. His city apartment was filled with soft morning light filtering through the half-open curtains, but it brought him no peace. For weeks, he had lain awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts like a ship on a restless river. Life seemed to flow past him without him truly taking the helm. At 30, he felt older than ever, as if the city had slowly hollowed him out. Outside, he heard the distant sound of a tram, the gentle whisper of bicycle tires on wet asphalt, and the monotonous drone of trucks starting their day. Yet it was not the city calling him, but something else, something deeper, a longing for space, for movement, for water. The memory of his grandfather surfaced, a man with rough hands and a gentle voice who used to tell him stories about inland shipping, about the freedom of sailing, the rhythm of the rivers, the silence of mornings when mist still hung over the water. When his grandfather passed away, Christian had received a modest inheritance. The money had sat untouched in his account for months, as if waiting for a purpose beyond a new car or a distant trip. Now, as he looked out the window at the gray sky, something began to dawn on him. Why not? Why not leave everything behind and become a skipper just like his grandfather? The idea felt absurd at first, but as the morning progressed, it took shape. It was no whim, he realized, but a dormant wish finally getting the chance to awaken. That same afternoon, he walked along the canal at the edge of the city. The air was heavy and humid, the water lying like a matte mirror between the quays. Occasionally, a ship passed by, slow and stately, with a rusty bow and a wheelhouse behind which the silhouette of a skipper was visible. Christian stopped and followed the ship with his eyes until it disappeared around a bend. He imagined what it would be like not to be a mere observer, but part of that world, to live with the rhythm of the water, letting the days be guided by locks, bridges, and the flow of the river. In the days that followed, he read everything he could find about inland shipping, about life on board, the long days, the hard work, the loneliness, and the freedom. He learned that a ship was never to be called a boat, that there were ranks and statuses, that as a skipper you were always somewhat dependent on others. On the weather, the current, the locks, and the bridges that sometimes delayed endlessly. Yet, it was precisely that dependence that attracted him. The idea that you cannot control everything, that you must learn to move with the circumstances. After weeks of searching, he found an advertisement, an old barge for sale, owned by a skipper who wanted to retire. The ship lay at an abandoned quay, surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. The paint was peeling, the deck full of rust spots, and the wood of the wheelhouse weathered by years of wind and rain. Yet Christian immediately felt this was his ship. The skipper, a man with a weathered face and bright eyes, told stories about the journeys he had made, about nights on the Rhine, about mist and silence, about the smell of wet steel and oil. Christian listened attentively, his thoughts drifting further away from the city. With his grandfather's inheritance, he bought the ship. The transfer was simple, almost solemn. The old skipper handed him the keys in a firm handshake. "Take good care of her," he said, his voice a mixture of wistfulness and pride. Christian felt the weight of the moment, the realization that he was truly at the beginning of something new. The first night on board, he barely slept. The ship lay still at the quay, yet he heard the water softly lapping against the hull. The scent of oil, wood, and old leather filled the small cabin. Outside, it was dark. Only the gentle glow of a street lamp shone through the porthole. Christian lay on his back thinking of all that still had to be done. Fixing up the ship, arranging paperwork, learning to navigate, facing the unknown. Yet he felt calmer than ever. The water rocked him slowly to sleep, like a promise of a new beginning. Thus it began, slow and hesitant, like the first kilometers of a long journey. The city gradually faded from his thoughts. The rhythm of the water took over. Christian knew that life as a skipper would be hard, full of unexpected turns and loneliness. But for the first time in a long while, he no longer felt adrift. The river lay before him, endless and unknown, and he was ready to follow it. The first week on board the old ship felt to Christiaan like stepping into another world. It was early morning when he stepped onto the gangplank. Cold mist still hung low over the water, and the grass along the quay was wet with dew. The ship lay still, lazily bobbing against the fenders, seeming to wait for what was to come. Christiaan walked slowly over the deck, his hand gliding over the weathered steel, the rust spots rough beneath his fingers. He breathed deeply, smelling the mixture of oil, wet wood, and a hint of diesel. The wheelhouse was small and simple. The wood was darkened by the years, the windows dull from dried raindrops and fingerprints. On the table lay a stack of yellowed charts, an old pair of binoculars, and a notebook with the handwriting of the previous skipper. Christiaan flipped through it, reading short notes about locks, water levels, and encounters along the way. It felt as if he was stepping into someone else's life, a life that was slowly becoming his own. The first days he spent mostly exploring the ship. Each space had its own smell, its own sounds. In the engine room it was warm and clammy, the smell of oil heavy in the air. He looked at the main engine, a bulky beast with thick pipes and greasy bolts. With the manual in hand, he learned to check the oil, monitor the coolant, inspect filters, and watch for leaks. The engine seemed to sigh like an old animal, but after some hesitation started reliably. Christiaan listened to the rhythmic hum and for the first time felt a little at home. There was always something to do on deck. He scrubbed rust spots, painted parts of the railing, repaired a loose rope. Sometimes he stood still and looked out over the water, where the morning sun slowly dispersed the mist. The world seemed to turn slower here. Occasionally, another ship passed by. The skipper greeted with a brief hand gesture. Christiaan still felt like an outsider, but the greetings gave him hope that he would one day be part of this community. Life on board was simple. He cooked his own meals on a rickety gas stove, ate at the small table in the galley, and listened to the gentle lapping of water against the hull. Sometimes his thoughts wandered to his grandfather, to the stories he used to hear about life on the river. Now he truly understood what his grandfather meant by the rhythm of the water, the loneliness that could sometimes be heavy but also brought peace. Each day he learned something new. How to properly secure a ship, especially when waves or swell rocked the water. How to watch his step and avoid getting caught in a loop of rope. How to check the batteries, gauge the water tank, and refill the grease pots. These were small tasks, but together they formed the heart of the ship. Christiaan often felt uncertain, afraid to make mistakes, yet he pushed himself to keep going. In the evenings, he would sit in the wheelhouse, gazing out over the dark water, listening to the sounds of the ship, the creaking of wood, the soft ticking of the engine, the whispering wind through the ropes. Sometimes doubt would creep in. Was this truly what he wanted? Life on the ship was hard, the work endless, and the prospect of long, solitary days sometimes daunting. But then he thought of the city, the hustle, the constant noise, the crowds of people. Here, on the water, he felt freer than ever. The days flowed gently by, slow and steady, like the water beneath the hull. By the end of the week, the ship was still old, still full of flaws, but it already felt more like home. Christiaan knew every corner, every creak in the wood, every stain on the deck. He knew there was still much to learn, that the real journey had only just begun. But as the sun set and the water turned golden, he felt, for the first time in a long while, content. The ship and he, together, on the way to something new. The days grew longer and spring hung in the air when Christiaan decided it was time to truly tackle the ship. Winter had left its marks, rust spots on the deck, peeling paint along the railings, and the scent of old steel mingling with the river's moisture. The ship had become his home, but it deserved better. He wanted not only to make it livable, but to create a place he could be proud of. One crisp morning, he called his good friend Hendrik. They had known each other for years, studied together, and shared a love for old machinery and the outdoors. Hendrik didn't hesitate when Christiaan asked for help. "Of course, I'm on my way. It's time that ship shines again," he said, a grin so wide it was almost audible through the phone. On the first day, they stood together on the deck, armed with wire brushes, sanders, and buckets of soapy water. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a soft light over the water. They began cleaning the steel, removing old paint remnants and sanding rust spots down to bare metal. It was hard work, their hands blackened with dust and their arms tired from scrubbing. But together they worked in a steady rhythm, punctuated by jokes and stories from the past. Hendrik proved to be a natural handyman. Where Christiaan sometimes hesitated, Hendrik knew exactly how to treat a rusted patch of deck. "Good sanding, then degrease, and only then the primer," he explained, carefully working on a rust spot. They worked methodically, part by part, and slowly the steel began to gleam under their hands. The sound of sandpaper, the tapping of tools, and the gentle lapping of water formed a soothing backdrop. After a few days, the ship was ready for its first coat of primer. They carefully chose the right paint, specially made for steel ships, to protect the metal against rust and the harsh weather on the water. While Christiaan painted the railing with a wide brush, Hendrik rolled paint onto the deck. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the crisp air of the river. Sometimes they took breaks, sitting on overturned buckets, watching ducks swim by and boats glide past. Painting was a precise job. They carefully masked everything off, checked repeatedly that the paint was applied evenly, and gave each layer plenty of time to dry. "Patience is half the work," Hendrik said, smoothing out a bump. In the evenings, they sat together in the wheelhouse, tired but satisfied, sipping coffee and listening to the wind whistle past the windows. They talked about the future, about journeys they wanted to take, about the feeling of freedom the water gave them. Besides painting, they tackled other repairs. They replaced rotten wooden parts, fixed a leaking porthole, and applied new sealant along the seams. Sometimes the work seemed endless, but every day they saw progress. The ship became more beautiful, stronger, more theirs. Working with Hendrik gave Christiaan not only practical help, but new energy. Where he sometimes got lost in his own thoughts, Hendrik brought lightness and decisiveness. They complemented each other, encouraged one another to persevere, even when the work was hard or the weather turned against them. After a week of hard work, they stood together on the deck, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and the soft light of the setting sun. The ship gleamed like never before, the steel shining and the colors sharp against the water. Christiaan felt proud, not only of the ship, but of himself and his friendship with Hendrik. It was the start of a new chapter, where the ship was not only his home, but proof that together they could move mountains, even on the water. The days after painting and refurbishing felt different. The ship seemed renewed not only on the outside, but also within. Christiaan noticed he walked the deck with more pride, and the idea grew that it was time to really put the ship to use. One evening, while sitting on board together with a cup of coffee and the last rays of sunlight over the water, Hendrik suggested joining him on a voyage. "Why don't I just stay on board for a while?" he said, his eyes on the sparkling water. "Two heads are better than one, and I've always wanted to see what it's really like in inland shipping." Christiaan didn't have to think long. The thought of sailing together, sharing the work and responsibility brought him peace. "That sounds wonderful," he said, genuine relief in his voice. The next morning, they began preparing the ship for their first trip. They checked the engine, refilled the water tanks, and cleaned the cargo hold. The smell of fresh paint was still present, but now mingled with the excitement of the unknown. Finding work proved harder than expected. They called various companies, sent emails, and asked around in the harbors where they docked. Often they were kindly received, but most clients preferred experienced skippers or larger ships. "It's not easy to break in," Hendrik noted, as they discussed their options in the wheelhouse. Yet they didn't give up. Every day they tried again, asked other skippers, and inquired with small sand and gravel traders. After a few days, they finally got a chance. A small sand merchant in the region had a load of sand that needed to be brought to a construction site on the edge of a city. It wasn't a big job, but for Christiaan and Hendrik it felt like a breakthrough. The client was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, perhaps because he saw their enthusiasm or because he himself had started with an old ship once. The evening before their first job, they sat together on the deck. The sky was clear, the river still, and in the distance, the soft sound of a passing ship. "Tomorrow it really begins," Christiaan said, staring at the water. Hendrik nodded and smiled. "We made this happen together. Now let's show we can do it." The next morning, they were ready early at the unloading quay. The ship floated quietly, the cargo hold open and prepared to be filled with sand. As the first shovelfuls of sand fell into the hold, Christiaan felt a mixture of excitement and pride. This was the beginning he had long awaited, together with his friend on his own ship working on the river. Loading the sand began early in the morning. A mobile crane with a clamshell bucket stood ready on the quay, its steel arms swinging steadily above the ship's hold. With a dull thud, the first load of sand dropped into the hold, dust swirling up and immediately settling in the moist morning air. Christiaan and Hendrik stood on deck, watching the loading process closely and consulting with the crane operator to evenly distribute the sand. Occasionally, the scrape of a shovel sounded as they manually leveled some piles to keep the ship stable. The loading took several hours. The crane worked steadily, trucks coming and going to deliver more sand. Hendrik joked about their new life as real skippers, but in his eyes, Christiaan saw the same tension he felt himself. The ship slowly sank deeper into the water, the hull drawing closer to the quay. When the hold was full, they checked together that the load was well balanced and covered the hold with tarps. That evening, they decided to stay overnight on location. Twilight fell over the water, the sounds of the harbor slowly fading away. In the wheelhouse, they ate a simple meal, listened to the gentle lapping of the water, and felt the day's fatigue in their limbs. Outside, the scent of wet sand and oil hung in the air. They talked quietly about the route for the next day, but the tension soon gave way to drowsiness. In their small cabins, they quickly fell asleep, the ship gently rocking on the water. The next morning came early. The sky was clear, the water mirror smooth. Christiaan felt a slight nervousness, but also determination. Fortunately, as a teenager, he had earned his skipper's license when he once toyed with the idea of becoming a barge captain. That knowledge now came in handy. He made a last round of the deck, checked the ropes, the engine, and the cargo. Hendrik cast off the mooring lines, and with a deep breath, Christiaan started the engine. The ship slowly came to life, the engine humming reassuringly. Christiaan took his place behind the wheel, his hands lightly gripping the wood. Hendrik stood beside him, watching the water and the banks. The first meters were cautious, but once they reached open water, Christiaan felt how the ship, fully loaded, glided steadily through the water. The weight of the sand made the ship sit deeper, sailing more calmly and steadily. The wind had little effect, and the ship responded gently to the rudder, though Christiaan noticed it turned more slowly and needed more time to slow down. Together, they kept an eye on the sailing schedule, discussed the route to take, and regularly checked the engine and cargo. Christiaan gradually grew more confident at the helm. The knowledge from his skipper's license returned. He watched the signs along the water, accounted for other vessels, and observed speed limits. Hendrik noted the sailing times and kept the charts handy. Occasionally, they had to slow down for a bridge or a lock. Christiaan maneuvered carefully, aware that with the loaded ship, the vessel felt much heavier and didn't stop as quickly. The great weight made the ship steady on course, but also required more foresight when steering and braking. Hendrik assisted with mooring and communicating with the bridge keeper, ensuring everything went smoothly. As the day progressed, their confidence grew. They enjoyed the view, green banks, reeds along the water, and the occasional fishing heron. The sun shone on the deck, and the ship steadily glided toward their destination. Christiaan felt like a true skipper for the first time, with Hendrik by his side, heading toward a new future on the water. The journey to the unloading site was calm and steady, the ship heavy and stable in the water with the sand deep in the hold. The morning sun slid over the deck as Christiaan and Hendrik followed their route, the bank slowly passing by. A gentle tension lingered in the wheelhouse, for they knew a few locks still lay between them and their destination. The first lock appeared on the horizon, the light above the lock gates still red. Christiaan carefully maneuvered the ship to the waiting area and secured it to the bollard, just as he remembered from his sailing lessons. They waited patiently until the light turned green, other ships gathering behind them. The water lapped softly against the quay wall, and Hendrik silently watched the lockkeeper begin the locking process. When the signal came, they entered the lock in order of arrival, the ship moving slowly and straight between the high walls. Christiaan held the wheel firmly, watching the propeller wash of commercial vessels, steering the ship steadily to the correct spot in the lock chamber. Hendrik nimbly jumped on deck, threw the lines around the bollards, and ensured the ship was securely moored. They watched as the water level slowly dropped, easing the lines as needed to prevent the ship from pressing too tightly against the wall. The process repeated at the next locks. Sometimes they had to wait a while, sometimes they could proceed immediately. Everything went smoothly. The weather cooperated, the wind was light, and water traffic was manageable. Christiaan felt his nerves slowly fade. With each lock, his confidence grew, and the actions became routine. Hendrik was an indispensable help, overseeing the deck, watching the lines, and giving directions when needed. After the last lock on their route, the landscape opened up again. The river widened, the water sparkling in the late morning light. They approached the unloading site, where a small quay stood with a few trucks and a crane ready to unload the sand. Christiaan reduced speed, steered the ship calmly toward the quay, and Hendrik jumped on deck again to secure the lines around the bollards. When the ship was still, they looked at each other, tired but satisfied. Their first voyage as skipper and mate was over, and everything had gone well. Outside, the sound of the crane preparing to unload their sand echoed softly. The ship gently rocked on the water, the tension of the journey slipping from their shoulders. Christiaan felt truly at home on the water for the first time, with Hendrik at his side and the ship as their shared pride. The unloading of the sand began immediately after mooring. The crane operator, a man with a weathered cap and a friendly smile, stepped aboard to discuss the details with Christiaan and Hendrik. It was a simple process. The clamshell bucket dipped into the hold, scooped up sand, and dropped it with a dull thud into the bed of a waiting truck. The rhythm was slow, almost hypnotic. Each bucket load lifted the ship fractionally lighter in the water, the difference barely noticeable but still felt beneath their feet. Christiaan stood on deck, watching as the sand slowly disappeared from the hold. Hendrik helped guide the crane's bucket, giving directions when needed, and making sure no last grains of sand were left behind in the corners. The air was filled with the dry dust of sand, settling like a thin veil over the deck. The sound of the crane, the shuffle of boots on steel, and the gentle lapping of water created a soothing background. When the hold was finally empty, they inspected the ship together. Everything had gone well. No damage, no unexpected problems. The crane operator gave them an approving nod. "Well done, gentlemen," he said, tipping his weathered cap and wiping sweat from his brow. Christiaan felt a quiet pride rise within him. Their first job had gone smoothly. After unloading, they cleaned the deck, swept the sand together, and rinsed it off with river water. The scent of wet steel and earth lingered in the air, but the ship immediately felt lighter, almost as if it breathed a sigh of relief. Hendrik joked about their first real cargo, and together they laughed, tired but content. That evening they sat together in the wheelhouse. The empty river shimmered in the last light of day. They drank coffee from enamel mugs and let their thoughts wander to what might come next. The job was done, The ship had proven itself, and they had shown they could carry a cargo together without trouble. But the question remained, what now? Hendrik was the first to speak. We need to look for the next load. Now that we've done this, maybe we can knock on the doors of other small traders. Or perhaps there are farmers nearby who want something transported. We have to try. Christiaan nodded. He felt the calm of the moment, but also the unrest of the unknown. The river was endless, the possibilities many, but it was up to them to find their way. Maybe tomorrow we can make a round along the quays, he suggested. Ask at the unloading spots, see if there's work. Now we have something to show. They made a list of potential clients, noted down names of companies they had seen along the way, and thought about how best to present themselves. It was a new kind of excitement, not uncertainty, but anticipation. Night slowly fell over the water. The ship lay still at the quay, ready for whatever was to come. As they prepared to sleep, Christiaan felt a calm satisfaction. The first step had been taken. The river lay open before them, with new chances on the horizon. Tomorrow would be a new day, with new opportunities, new conversations, and perhaps a new cargo. But now, in the quiet of the evening, there was only the soft rocking of the ship and the comforting knowledge that they could move forward together. The next morning began with the soft sound of birds along the bank and the first sunlight spilling into the wheelhouse. Christiaan and Hendrik had a simple breakfast of bread and coffee while going over their list of potential clients. Before they could start their rounds, footsteps sounded on the quay. A man in a blue overall, weathered hat, and sturdy boots stood by the ship. His face was sun-tanned, and his hands bore the marks of years of hard work on the land. "Good morning, gentlemen," the man began, his voice friendly but firm. "I heard yesterday you brought sand. I'm Farmer van der Vood from the village nearby. I've been looking for a skipper to transport some of my harvest to the city. The big guys don't have time for small loads, but maybe this is something for you?" Christiaan and Hendrik exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of chance they had hoped for. "What needs to be transported?" Hendrik asked, gesturing invitingly toward the gangplank. The farmer stepped aboard and explained it was a load of potatoes and onions, destined for the market in a city further down the river. It wasn't a huge cargo, but enough to fill the ship and make a pleasant journey. "It's not far," the farmer said, "but it saves me days of work with the truck. And if it goes well, I might have more work for you." Together they toured the ship, inspected the hold, and discussed the details. The farmer was pleased with what he saw, a solid ship, nicely refurbished, manned by two men who took their craft seriously. They agreed the cargo would be loaded the next morning at the farm, at a small unloading quay just outside the village. That day, Christiaan and Hendrik prepared the ship for the new cargo. They swept the hold clean, laid down tarps, and made sure everything could be securely fastened. Hendrik joked about the smell of fresh potatoes instead of sand dust, and together they laughed, relieved that the ship had work again. The next morning was early. The sun had just risen when they arrived at the farm. The farmer was already waiting with his helpers, crates full of potatoes and sacks of onions carefully loaded aboard. The work was relaxed. Laughter, exchanged stories, and the occasional joke about farm life in the water. When everything was loaded, the farmer thanked them warmly. "I hope it's a good trip, gentlemen, and when you're back, feel free to stop by for a cup of coffee." Christiaan promised they would handle the cargo with care. The ship was full again, but different from last time. A light, earthy scent hung in the hold, and the weight of the harvest felt like a new responsibility. Christiaan started the engine. Hendrik cast off the lines, and slowly they sailed up the river, away from the farm, heading toward the city. The water was calm, the sun low in the sky, and the ship glided quietly forward. In the wheelhouse, Christiaan and Hendrik sat, their eyes on the water, their thoughts on the journey ahead. It was a new beginning, a new chance, and they were ready together. The ship moved slowly but steadily through the quiet canal, the engine humming softly and regularly beneath their feet. The harvest cargo lay firmly secured in the hold, and above deck, the scent of fresh earth and onions lingered. The morning mist slowly lifted, turning the water into a silver ribbon winding through the landscape. On both sides of the canal, tall reeds swayed in the wind, interspersed with pollarded willows and alders whose branches dipped down to the water. Christiaan stood, focused at the helm. He felt calm, almost dreamy, as the ship made its way through the still water. The tension of the first jobs had faded. Now there was only the rhythm of sailing, the gentle rocking of the ship, and the view of nature slowly passing by. Occasionally, they passed an old farm where cows lay lazily in the grass and noisy geese paraded across the yard. Sometimes they saw a heron standing motionless at the water's edge, or a kingfisher flashing by like a blue-green streak. Hendrik sat on a coiled rope reel on deck, his legs dangling over the water. He visibly enjoyed the peace and the view. "This is quite different from the city," he said softly, twirling a piece of reed between his fingers. "Here, everything seems to move slower. You only hear the water, the birds, and sometimes the soft whisper of the wind through the trees." Christiaan nodded, smiling. He felt the same calm settle within him, a feeling that everything was exactly as it should be. They passed small hand-operated bridges where children waved from the shore and cyclists paused to watch the ship glide by. Sometimes they had to slow down for a bend, the water gently lapping against the hull as the ship lazily turned within the canal. The banks were lush and full of life. Wild ducks floated among the water lilies. A group of swans glided gracefully past, and in the distance, they even spotted a few grazing cattle in a nature reserve along the water. The sun climbed slowly higher in the sky, the light growing warmer, and the colors of the landscape becoming more vivid. They passed a stretch where the canal widened, opening up to a field full of blooming flowers where bees and butterflies flitted back and forth. Hendrik pointed to a group of white herons rising from the reeds. "You don't see this sitting in an office," he said, his voice full of wonder. The mood on board was relaxed and content. They spoke little, mostly enjoying the silence and the nature surrounding them. Occasionally, they switched places. Hendrik took the helm so Christiaan could make a cup of coffee in the small galley, the sound of the gas stove bubbling, mixing softly with the gentle rustling of the water. They ate their lunch on deck, watching the passing banks and the sky slowly shift from blue to soft white through the veil of clouds. The journey through the canal felt like traveling through another world, far from the hustle and noise of the city. The ship was their home, the water their path, and nature their companion. As they sailed onward toward the city, Christiaan and Hendrik felt more and more connected to the rhythm of the water and life on board. The trip was simple, almost still, but all the more special for it. It was a day that drifted slowly by, full of small, quiet moments that nestled in their memories like a soft, contented dream. As the afternoon wore on, the light changed gradually. The sun lowered, casting long shadows over the water. The banks grew more densely vegetated, the reeds tall and swaying, and occasionally the sharp call of a coot defending its territory echoed. Christiaan felt a gentle drowsiness wash over him. The calm of sailing, the lapping water, and the soft hum of insects were almost hypnotic. Hendrik now stood at the helm, his gaze calmly fixed on the bends of the canal. He had quickly found a feel for the ship and steered with steady hands. Christiaan sat on the bench beside the wheelhouse, legs drawn up, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands. He thought about how far they had come from the first uncertain beginnings to now, sailing together with a cargo from a real client. It felt like a small victory. They passed a sleepy village where a few children stood fishing at the water's edge. One of them waved enthusiastically upon seeing the ship, and Hendrik waved back broadly. The houses faced the water, their gardens full of flowers and laundry gently fluttering in the breeze. On a small jetty, an old man sat reading a newspaper, glancing up and nodding as they passed. The canal made a gentle curve and opened onto a wider waterway. In the distance, they could already make out the city's outlines, a few church towers, the silhouettes of bridges, and the faint murmur of traffic carried over the water. Nature slowly gave way to activity. More boats appeared on the water, from small rowboats to larger cargo ships. Hendrik slowed their pace and consulted with Christiaan about the approach to the unloading site. "We'll need to be careful when docking," Christiaan said. "We have to watch where we're allowed to tie up and make sure the cargo can be unloaded properly." Hendrik nodded. Both felt the gentle tension of nearing their destination. But it was a healthy tension, the kind that keeps you alert. Slowly, they entered the city. The banks were reinforced with quay walls. Old warehouses stood side by side with modern apartment buildings. People walked along the quay, some watching the ship and its cargo with curiosity. They sought out the unloading spot the farmer had mentioned, a simple quay on the edge of the center, where a small truck was already waiting to take the harvest. With care, they steered the ship toward the quay. Christiaan jumped on deck, threw the lines around the bollards, and checked that the ship was secure. Hendrik switched off the engine. The hum ceased, and a sudden silence fell over the deck. They looked at each other and smiled. It had worked. The farmer's unloading crew was already waiting. Together, they lifted crates and sacks from the hold and loaded them onto the truck. The work was easygoing, with occasional jokes and small talk about the weather or the journey. The farmer himself came over shortly after, thanked them warmly, and handed over an envelope with their earned wages. "You did well, men. Next time again?" Christiaan and Hendrik nodded. With the ship empty again and the sun slowly setting behind the city, they felt a deep satisfaction. They stayed a while longer on deck, listening to the sounds of the city quietly settling down. The water gently lapped against the hull, and in the distance the sound of a church bell rang out. The day came to an end, the journey completed. But as the city bathed in the evening light, they both knew this was only the beginning. The river lay open again for new adventures, new jobs, new days on the water, and together, with their ship and their friendship, they were ready for whatever was to come. Evening slowly fell over the city, and a soft orange glow colored the water between the quay walls. Christiaan and Hendrik sat silently on deck, their legs dangling over the edge, while the day's bustle slowly faded away. Occasionally, the jingle of a bicycle bell or the murmur of voices from the quay could be heard, but otherwise it was quiet. The city seemed to prepare for the night as the ship gently rocked on the calm canal water. They were tired but content. The cargo had been safely delivered, the farmer had appreciated their work, and talk of a next job had already begun. For the first time since the start of their adventure, life on the water felt like a natural rhythm. The uncertainty of the first days had given way to growing confidence. They could do this. They belonged here, between the water, the steel of the ship, and the slowly turning world of inland shipping. Christiaan stood and stretched. "Shall we take a little walk through the city?" he suggested. "Stretch our legs, maybe get something to eat?" Hendrik nodded. They carefully secured the ship, letting it gently sway against the quay, and walked into the city together. The streets were still warm from the sun, terraces full of people enjoying the summer evening. They found a small cafe, ordered simple food, and sat outside, watching people pass by and the lights slowly come on in the windows above the street. Over their meal, they spoke about the journey, the nature along the canal, the calm of sailing, and the contrast with city life. Hendrik shared how he felt increasingly at home on the ship, how the days on the water gave him a kind of calm he had never known before. Christiaan listened, nodded, and felt the same. The ship had become more than just a means of transport. It was a home, a place where they could be themselves. After their meal, they walked slowly back to the quay. The city was quiet now, lanterns casting long shadows over the water. They climbed aboard, made one last round to check that everything was safe, and retreated to their cabins. The gentle rocking of the ship, the distant sound of a train passing in the night, and the steady lapping of the water slowly lulled them to sleep. The next morning, they were awakened by the first light filtering through the porthole. The city was still silent. Only the soft chirping of birds and the distant hum of a motorcycle drifted over the water. Christiaan brewed coffee, while Hendrik fried eggs in the small galley. They ate on deck, the sun warming their faces, and discussed their plans for the day. There was work to be done on the ship. The deck needed sweeping again, the engine checked, and the water tank refilled. But there was also time to look for new jobs. Christiaan picked up his phone, scrolling through messages and notes, and to his delight saw a message from the farmer. "If you have time, I might need another load in a few days." Hendrik grinned broadly when he heard this. "We're not done here yet, mate." Life on the water had found its own rhythm. The days were shaped by the work, the weather, the river's flow, and the encounters with people along the shore. Christiaan and Hendrik felt more and more like skippers, more part of the world between bank and ship. And as the city slowly awoke and the water began to stir again, they knew their adventure had only just begun. The days that followed drifted by at a gentle pace. Christiaan and Hendrik prepared the ship for the next load, swept the deck, checked the engine, and refilled the water tank. The scent of oil and wet steel had become familiar, as had the soft creaking of the wood and the steady hum of the generator when they needed power. They settled into small routines, breakfasting together on deck, discussing the route, checking weather reports, and keeping the logbook. Between work, they took walks through the city. Sometimes they wandered narrow streets, admired the facades of old warehouses, or sipped coffee on a terrace by the water. They spoke with other skippers, learned new names, and heard stories of distant voyages, fierce storms, and unexpected friendships born on the water. Hendrik visibly enjoyed life on the ship and the freedom it offered. "I never thought I'd feel at home on the water so quickly," he said one evening, as they watched the sun set together. The farmer's next job did not keep them waiting long. This time it was a load of beets, destined for a factory further downstream. The farmer was already waiting at the small landing stage, his face sunburned from working the land. With the help of his men, the beets were loaded into the hold. It was hard work, but the mood was good. Laughter filled the air, stories were exchanged, and from the barn came the occasional sound of a radio. When everything was loaded, Christiaan and Hendrik said goodbye to the farmer and set course for the factory. The weather was mild, a gentle breeze rippled the water, and the sky was clear blue. The river wound through the landscape, past fields of blooming flowers and forests showing the first signs of autumn. They passed small villages where children waved from the shore and fishermen cast their lines into the water. Along the way, they talked about the future. "Do you think we can keep this up for long?" Hendrik asked as he took the helm. Christiaan thought for a moment. "I hope so, as long as there's work and we do it together. I see no reason to go back to the old life." Hendrik nodded. "It's different, but it suits us. No traffic jams, no office, just the water and the ship." The journey went smoothly. They had to wait a few times at locks, but it gave them time to lunch on deck and enjoy the view. Sometimes there was only the sound of water and wind, sometimes the call of a bird or the rattle of a distant train. The calm was almost tangible, and both men felt increasingly at home. Upon arrival at the factory, they were warmly welcomed. The beets were unloaded, the ship grew lighter again, and the work went smoothly. The foreman thanked them and asked if they were available more often. Christiaan smiled. "We're always looking for the next load." That evening, back on the ship, they sat together in the wheelhouse. The sky was clear, stars reflected in the dark water. They talked about the day, the people they had met, and the little things that made life on the water special. The sound of an owl at night, the gentle rocking of the ship, the scent of wet grass after a rain shower. Christiaan looked at Hendrik and felt a deep contentment. They were no longer searching, no longer strangers on the water. They had become skippers, part of a world slowly opening up before them. And as night fell and the ship gently rocked on the river, he knew they would make many more journeys together, through quiet canals, along green banks to new towns and new stories. The next morning, the ship was awakened by the soft patter of rain on the deck. It was still early, the sky was gray and heavy, the river lay like a mirror beneath the low-hanging clouds. Christiaan stretched in his small cabin, listened briefly to the familiar sound of water against the hull, then got up to make coffee. In the wheelhouse, he found Hendrik already staring out at the wet world, a mug in his hands. "It's the kind of day you just want to stay in bed," Hendrik mumbled with a sleepy smile. Christiaan nodded but felt content nonetheless. The rain gave the ship a cozy feeling, as if they were drifting together in their own little world, far from everything. After breakfast, they prepared the ship for departure. They had received a message from a local wholesaler. A load of sacks of grain needed to be taken to a village further along, a half-day's journey. It wasn't a big job, but it kept them moving and brought a little money in. They loaded the grain into the hold, carefully covered everything against the rain, and departed in the soft morning mist. The river was calm. The rain muffled all sounds, making the ship seem to float through a dreamlike landscape. The banks were vaguely visible, trees and bushes forming soft shadows in the mist. Occasionally, they saw a fishing boat, a startled heron taking flight, or a group of cows sheltering under a tree. The water gently lapped against the hull, the engine hummed quietly, and a cozy warmth filled the wheelhouse. They spoke little during the journey. Sometimes Hendrik pointed out a special bird, an old farm, or a field of wildflowers that even in the rain gave color to the landscape. Christiaan felt calm, almost meditative. Sailing was no longer exciting or new, but a ritual, a part of their daily life. By midday, the weather cleared. The rain stopped, the sky brightened, and cautiously the sun broke through the clouds. Dew sparkled on the grass along the banks, and the water regained its familiar blue hue. In the distance, they could already see the village of few houses, a church with a pointed tower, and a small unloading quay where a few men waited. The unloading went smoothly. The men from the wholesaler worked quickly and efficiently, transferring the sacks of grain onto a cart, and thanked Christiaan and Hendrik for their arrival. There was some quiet talk about the weather, the harvest, and life on the water. The men offered coffee, and for a moment they all sat together on the quay, watching the ship and the slowly flowing river. When the work was done, Christiaan and Hendrik said their goodbyes and sailed back gently, the sun now high in the sky. The return journey felt light and cheerful. The ship was empty, the water sparkled, and the air was fresh after the rain. They spoke of the coming days, of possible new jobs, of the small things that made life on the ship so special. As evening fell, they moored again at their familiar quay. The city lay bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the water calm, and the sky filled with swallows. They ate a simple meal on deck and watched silently as the water slowly darkened. That night, as the ship gently rocked on the river and the city settled into rest, Christiaan felt more at home than ever. Life on the water was simple, sometimes hard, but always filled with small moments of happiness. Together with Hendrik, the ship, and the river, he was home. And deep inside, he knew there would be many more journeys to come. Through rain and sun, along quiet banks and bustling cities, always moving toward the unknown. The next morning, Christiaan was awakened by the soft morning light filtering through the porthole. Outside, the air was clear and fresh. The rain from the day before had washed the dust from the city, and the water gleamed like new. He heard the muffled sound of Hendrik sweeping the deck, the broom moving rhythmically over the steel. The ship felt clean and light, as if it breathed a sigh of relief after the rain. After breakfast, fresh bread from the baker by the quay and strong coffee, they discussed their plans. There was no new cargo yet, but neither man felt rushed. They decided to thoroughly inspect the ship, do small maintenance tasks, and check the engine. While Hendrik checked the deck for loose bolts and rust spots, Christiaan disappeared into the engine room. The smell of oil and metal was familiar, the soft ticking of tools sounding reassuring in the enclosed space. The morning passed at a gentle pace. Occasionally, they spoke with other skippers passing by on the quay. There was chatting about the weather, the water levels, and who was heading where. Christiaan noticed how he was becoming more part of this small community of people living by the rhythm of the river. Everyone knew each other, greeted with a brief nod or a raised hand, and sometimes exchanged tips about possible jobs. After lunch, a simple salad and some fruit, they decided to take a walk along the quay. The city was lively, children played by the water, and on a terrace, people sat in the sunlight talking and laughing. They walked to the end of the harbor where the water widened and the river opened to the countryside. There, sitting on an old wooden bench, they silently watched the water. A few coots dived beneath the surface. A fishing boat drifted slowly by, and in the distance, the soft barking of a dog echoed. "Do you think we'll ever tire of this?" Hendrik asked, his gaze on the horizon. Christiaan shook his head. "I don't think so. It's always changing. Every day is different, every journey is different, and as long as we sail together, it's good." They stayed a while longer, listening to the sounds of water and wind. When they walked back to the ship, Christiaan felt a deep contentment. Life had become simple again, reduced to its essence. Sailing, working, eating, sleeping, and above all, enjoying the moments in between. Back on board, they found a note slipped under the wheelhouse door. It was from a skipper they had met earlier, with a tip for a new cargo. A small factory on the edge of the city was looking for someone to transport a load of wood to a village further along the river. Christiaan smiled and showed the note to Hendrik. "Shall we go take a look?" That afternoon, they walked together to the factory. The site lay by the water, among stacks of planks and the sounds of saws and hammers. The owner, a friendly woman with a firm handshake, explained it was a load of oak wood, destined for a carpenter in a village upstream. It wasn't a large cargo, but just right for their ship. They agreed the wood would be loaded the next morning. Back on board, Christiaan and Hendrik prepared the hold, laid down tarps, and made sure everything could be securely fastened. Evening slowly fell over the city, the sky soft orange, and the water dark and still. That night, Christiaan lay in his bunk, listening to the gentle rocking of the ship and the distant sounds of the city. He thought of the journey ahead, the wood to be loaded, the river that always flowed onward. Life was simple but rich with small moments of happiness. And with Hendrik by his side and the ship as their home, he felt ready for whatever was to come. The next morning began with the familiar ritual, making coffee, sweeping the deck, and preparing the ship together for a new journey. The sun was already low in the sky when the truck with the oak wood arrived. The factory men carefully loaded the planks aboard, stacking them neatly and helping Christiaan and Hendrik secure everything firmly. Laughter filled the air. Stories were exchanged about carpentry in the village and life along the river. Once the cargo was loaded, they said goodbye to the factory owner, who handed them an extra thermos of coffee for the road. Christiaan started the engine, Hendrik cast off the lines, and slowly the ship glided back onto the river, away from the city's bustle. It was a clear day. The air was fresh, the water mirrored the clouds, and the banks were greener than ever. They sailed upstream, past fields where cows grazed and forests where the first autumn leaves had begun to fall. The journey was peaceful. Occasionally they passed another ship, always greeted with a wave or a brief whistle. Hendrik often sat on deck, his gaze on the water, while Christiaan focused on the wheel and the current. Along the way, they talked about everything and nothing. About the future, the people they had met, the small things that made life on the water so special. Hendrik shared how he had never felt so free before, how the days on the ship gave him a peace he had found nowhere else. Christiaan listened and felt the same. The ship had become their home, the river their path, and their friendship their anchor. After half a day of sailing, they reached the village where the wood was to be unloaded. The unloading spot was simple, a small quay, a few men ready to help. The unloading went quickly and smoothly. The carpenter, a friendly old man with a cap and a firm handshake, thanked them warmly. "This wood will become a new floor for the village cafe," he said proudly. "If you ever come back, there'll be a chair waiting for you." When the ship was empty again, Christiaan and Hendrik felt light and content. They said goodbye to the men on the quay and slowly sailed back down the river toward the city that by now felt familiar. The sun slowly sank behind the trees, the light turning golden, and the water softly lapped against the hull. That evening, back at their familiar mooring, they sat together on the deck. The city lay quiet in the evening light, the sky full of swallows and the soft sound of a distant church bell. They drank the last coffee from the thermos, fell into a comfortable silence, and gazed out over the water. "Do you think we'll keep doing this for a long time?" Hendrik finally asked, his voice gentle in the stillness of the night. Christiaan smiled. "As long as the ship sails, the river flows, and we are together, there will always be another journey. Maybe we'll stay here, maybe one day we'll sail further. But whatever happens, no one can ever take this away from us." The silence that followed was full of promise. The ship rocked softly on the water, the city slept, and above them the first stars twinkled. Life on the water had not always been easy, but it had given them what they sought: freedom, friendship, and a home that moved with them wherever they went. As night fell and the ship gently swayed on the river, Christiaan knew this was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of countless new journeys. The river would always keep flowing, and as long as they were together, they would always find their way. From town to village, from job to job, from morning to evening, again and again,